We have Mark with us. Had a little bit of technical difficulties, so I'm going to let you get started, Mark.
I'll just start right away. We're short on time. I apologize, everybody. I screwed up. My calendar said that I was on for a webinar tonight at 8 p.m., and so I was leisurely driving my way home when I realized it was on right now. So I was asked to give a little presentation on some of the things that I may have learned in agroforestry in the 20-plus years that I've been doing it. One of the things that was really fascinating is when I started, this is a aerial photograph of New Forest Farm right here. When I got started, there was hardly anybody doing any agroforestry that I knew of. It was really hard to find people before the internet and all that kind of stuff. Part of what I wanted to focus on tonight was soil. And I've learned a lot about soil, and that the agroforestry component of it is key to everything. When we moved to New Forest Farm 23 years ago, the soil was red clay, and by actively farming using agroforestry techniques, we actually have been able to turn red clay into what looks like topsoil, still heavy clay topsoil. And this little picture right here is taken from 80 feet up a wind turbine tower. And you can see across the street the red clay out in their fields, and then you can see right here the farm track where we've never done any of these other things that I'll show you. It's red clay in the wheel tracks, yet over here it looks like topsoil. We actually turned this topsoil on the left, we turned the red clay into topsoil using these techniques I'll show you. And as we see here, you can see, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, I assume you can. Here's the row of trees, an alley for the alley crop, a row of trees, and so on. We've done everything alley cropping. So here's an alley, there's a swale with a berm for water management, trees, alley, swale, berm, trees, and so on across the whole entire farm. This area up here is where we did alley cropping, or silvo arable, and this area in here is mostly silvopasture with animals. And now my screen isn't moving. Now it is. Okay, move. So what we did is in 20-plus years, we took what was abandoned corn land up above, and we turned it into what you see down below on the screen there. And so we used a particular suite of techniques. First of all, we identified our biome and its dominant plant communities, and then we strive to imitate that, because we figure we'll have the best success if we grow plants, trees, and shrubs, and bushes, vines, etc., that are adapted to our region. So what we did is we went to our local reference material on our natural plant communities, and then we chose the species that were marketable or suitable for feed for animals. Then we did some simple earthworks to manage the water resource. All the patterning that you see is the water being moved from high in the landscape in the valleys to slightly lower out on the ridges. It's a modified keyline design. Then we established the perennial polycultures. Most of our rows, we don't just grow a single species of tree like a lot of the classic agroforestry. It's not just walnut and crops. It's a plant community type, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. That everything follows the pattern of the water management pattern, from the tree planting to the agricultural production to the grazing, etc. And then we manage it forever. Some of the most fascinating things that blew my mind is, why is it in annual agriculture that we keep having to add inputs into the soil? Why do we always have to add fertilizer? Why do we always have to add compost and so on? Well, how is it that nature actually creates the soil? And if you look right here, this is simple primary succession, where you've got rock being colonized by lichens, which eventually gives way to mosses, to grasses, to trees, etc. This process happens anywhere and everywhere across the planet. If you leave, Chicago alone for a couple hundred years, all the buildings are going to crumble, and there's going to be soil on top of it. Where did the soil come from? The plants created the soil. The plants and the animal communities created the soil. And so much emphasis is being put on soil these days, especially in the organic world. We've been certified organic for 20-plus years. But it's not, building soil isn't just about litter, like mulches, etc., dead leaves, and so on. It's not just about the plants putting liquid sugars into the soil, their root exudates. It's not just about these decomposer organisms using that carbon as energy source, and then they mineralize the soil. And it's not just the mineral balance that is part of the fertility cycle. It's not just deposition in the form of dry deposition or wet deposition. It's all of it combined. In order to really create soil, I have to have all of these things combined. That's how we make richer soil and increase our yields. Once all of this is in place, things hum right along. The decay cycle is an essential driver of our system, and this is some of the stuff that really has excited me, because once I began to have and manage things in such a way that I had an active decomposition process, a hyperactive decomposition process, things just started to grow so much better. So I consider one of the things that I have learned is that the decay cycle is absolutely essential. It's really a really important driver of yields. So back to plant community types, the most prevalent in North America is revolves around pines and pines with pine nuts. Every region in the country has some sort of pines. All of these plants are compatible with pines in their native range. And if you look down this list, we've got pine nuts, beech, prunuses, cherries, plums, serviceberries, hazelnut, blueberry, raspberry, lingonberries, grapes, wintergreen, fungiforage, and livestock, etc. Different regions will have different sub-communities within there. All of these things, you can plant them right in the tree row, and they'll all vertically stack themselves up based on their natural heights, and they all have marketable products somehow, and they will all grow in your region if you're planting them. They will all grow without any inputs whatsoever. You can do inputs if you want, but they'll grow without inputs. If you're in California, California is mostly sugar pine. Colorado, Nevada, Utah, part of California, etc., is mostly pinyon pine. This is the range of sugar pine. So if you overlap the western states here, and the dark green that I put in here, this is probably where Italian pine would grow. In the east, anywhere where you have white pine, eastern white pine, Korean pine will work. If you're in the far north, Siberian pine, they're all pine nuts. So I'm just using that as an example, of pines as an example of a polyculture. One of the things that's important to know, and this ties into fertility, is understand the disturbance regime that your plant community type has adapted or was created for, whatever, and a whole pine plant community, the oak savanna plant community, both of those are fire-adapted biomes. And so what fire does is it comes through and it removes the brushy layer, removes a lot of the decadent dry grasses. It releases the ash, which is an alkalizing agent. It helps to neutralize acidic soil. And then, of course, it allows temperature to warm up a little quicker. When the sun strikes a nice black surface, you'll get a quicker green up in the spring if you've had burned fields. So fire is a component that we haven't used as much as I've wanted to. And what kind of the plant communities that I mentioned earlier, the pine-based plant communities, this is what they supported. The oak savanna and the pine savannas of North America were just seething with animals for zillions of years. We need to have animals in the system. They're a critical part of nutrient cycling. This is just a map of oak savanna, the classic oak savanna regions. In the east, in the humid east, there were holes in the forest canopy that had the same plant communities that are in the oak savanna. And the oak savanna were Fagaceae on the upper story. Malus was understory prunuses, which was cherries. Hazelnut was one of the dominant shrubs. Currants and gooseberries in the shade. Grapes climbing all over the whole mess. Raspberries and blackberries and grass. All of those are marketable products and or feed for animals. In the system, same plant communities with slight variants in California. So I don't know where people are from on this particular webinar, so I'm just kind of blasting it all out across North America. I'm going to go really fast through this, but managing the water is actually really important, because when we're planting extra plants on a system, we're going to be using extra water. One of the big things that the corn people are really whining about is, like, we can't afford to plant pecans on good land where pecans like to grow, because pecans use way more water to make the equivalent amount of calories and food as corn. So we need to grow more corn instead of pecans. Well, let's meet that argument and say, okay, we're going to grow corn and we're going to grow pecans, but we're not going to let water run off our property. We're going to catch it in little ditches and move it to where we want to move it. And so now this is a water-managed agroforestry system that no drops of water, no rainfall is allowed to leave this particular property unless it runs through the system all over the place, soaks into the ground, goes through a plant, comes out on an animal, and then it shows where our agroforestry tree rows go. And then we'll use a subsoiler. I've used a typical American single shank subsoiler, and in recent years I've gotten a keyline plow, a yeoman's plow, that I use episodically on annual fields where I'm doing alley cropping, and I use it fairly regularly out in the pastures just to get extra. I'm doing it to get extra water to soak in, but it also, you know, performs a little mechanical fracturing, and you'll get a little faster decomposition rate because you get water in there and you got air in there, and the decomposer organisms have a field day. This is probably 10 years ago. You can kind of see a couple trees out in this row here, and there's a few right over in that row there. We would do strip cropping in the middle. A lot of heavy plow downs with a lot of clovers and small grains. That's a 1 acre cucumber field there, and this is pretty amazing because this row of trees, that little curved row there and this one here, was visible on the very first shot from the wind turbine. Then would grow our crops. We've got 2 acres of asparagus. We've done between 1 and 2 acres of either acorn squash or some other type of winter squash every single year for 20 some odd years. It's pretty good money. And then we always keep fields that are in active cover crop rotation, which we'll show a little bit of. And one of the big weed problems in these fields is clover keep resprouting, because all this yellow sweet clover that you saw right there, that's all going to seed. And then, you know, once that seed drops, it's just tons and tons and tons of clover seeds. Keeps coming back really strong. This is the same field in a different year. Obviously, now you can see the hazelnuts are growing. It's hazelnuts here. On the upper side of this field, it's hazelnut with hybrid poplar. Do a lot with chestnut alley cropping. So in the early years, the cash flow was all squash and, you know, asparagus and so on, and or livestock. One of the questions, I was in Washington, D.C. at a National Agroforestry thing last week, and I was asked, well, you know, what are the economics of the agroforestry system? And one of the things that I've learned is that it has been, at least in the first 15 years or so, the majority of the cash flow is coming from the non-woody components of the system. It's been the produce and the livestock that has been cash flowing the operation. So, you know, we could have cash flowed just doing produce and livestock, but I get all the benefits of having these woody plants depositing leaves, you know, digging roots deep, helping water to infiltrate, and I've got the extra crop that I can use. Some dinger bell just rang. I hope it works. This is that curved field. Notice the shed in the background. So the picture with the stripes of clover and zucchini, we're in the next field over, and look at how the trees have grown. While the trees are maturing, I'm cash flowing in the middle. This is a time when I'm just tilling under, lightly tilling under, about 2-3 inches deep, some of the weeds. This is my 2-shank yeoman's plow. I use it in part for root pruning, to keep the roots of these trees from coming out into my alley crop. You know, I was over in France 2 years ago at the European Agroforestry Conference, and they were saying that the yield depression from trees taking nutrients and moisture from your crop is statistically insignificant, and so they say don't bother to root prune next to your trees, whereas in the States, I guess they have data that says otherwise. I root prune anyways, simply because this is part of my water collection strategy that moves water out towards the ridge. That ridge in front of the tractor is actually one of the wettest spots that I've got. And I use small grains, rye, wheat, triticale, and barley. I've grown all of those. I've also grown field peas. And in years that I need the cash, I've harvested the grains, and of course all the straw just stays in place. My biggest reason for growing that is for carbon. 6,000 plus miles of roots on one rye plant. there's about 2.5 tons below ground carbon and about 2 tons above ground carbon. I think that's the number. Don't try to dial me in on that one. I want it for the carbon because that's feeding my decomposition rate, which is releasing all the nutrients for my crops. What's interesting in this picture, I showed this. That's a wind turbine. I was up there when I took the first picture. These lines that you see, the subsoiler, where the subsoiler has gone through, typically the crop will grow better in that, and I think it's possibly because it's such a deep slot, more moisture, and it's real soft, crumbly soil after you drag the subsoiler through it. So you can't really see it up close, but you can kind of see it's higher, lower, higher, lower, higher, lower. You get a yield increase where the subsoiler slots are. I typically will go ahead and I'll let the whatever the small grain is, I'll let it grow to maturity. I'm after the hard, woody carbon. Now, it's been said over and over again that you don't want it to go to hard carbon because that's going to take the nitrogen away from your soil. It's like, well, one cycle. Once you've got all that carbon in there and you've taken all that nitrogen because it's now the proteins that are in your decomposer organisms, once you've got your decomposer organisms up to speed, now you can just keep feeding it carbon, and you've already taken that nitrogen out, and so you're back at a neutral balanced situation. And I do mixtures of cover crops, not just the small grain species. I'll do clovers, peas, etc., to have a diversity of roots in there, diversity of exudates, and of course the nitrogen from clovers. You can see a lot of the clovers in the understory. It's yellow sweet clover. A lot of people say, oh, you can't have yellow sweet clover, it's kind of invasive. It's like, well, I'm kind of interested in having a single tap-rooted, deep tap-rooted plant, 8 foot tall, 10 zillion pounds of seed that reseeds itself. I'm okay with that. It's a biennial. If you till it once, it's dead, whereas alfalfa, you can hit that with a tiller or a plow and roll it over and over and over and over again, disc it up half the summer, and it never goes away. So what I'll do if I don't need the cash from selling the grains, I'll run the livestock through it first, and there's not a lot out there for cattle to eat, for example. So they'll start, just trampling it down. They're trying to get the green. And then I'll go through with my front-end loader with the bucket slightly tilted back toward me, and I mash it down so it looks like this. So now I've got, a 4 to 6 inch layer of mulch on the surface, and what comes up through the mulch is all the clovers that were underneath it, and some of the seed heads of rye or wheat, whatever it is, will start to sprout, and I'll get a second generation of small grains. So that's the kind of mulch layer I get. Now, many organic growers haul in place tons and tons and tons of mulch. I just grow it in place, lay it down, strip till into it, and as you can tell, when I'm laying down this mulch, it's actually benefiting my trees as well because I'm getting all of that carbon and all that decomposition rate going on right there. On the silvopasture side, I'm running cattle and hogs and chickens. I put them right out in with the trees from when the trees are really, really young. At first I was nervous that it was going to kill the trees and all that, but then I realized that the reason why cattle will kill your trees is because you're not moving your cattle fast enough. They want to eat grass. That's their primary thing. And as long as you keep moving them through, they'll do something like this. On a farm, every once in a while, something works perfectly, and this particular rotation was just exactly what I was looking for. I like to see about a 50% trample, so they graze off the tops, and they walk down a lot of it. I kind of pack them in fairly close, and then they break branches and they nibble on the trees and all that kind of stuff. But then there's what, 72 cow patties a day and 35 gallons of urine per animal. That's amazing fertilizer, and then they've already knocked down the weeds and they've mulched the trees. The trees love it. They grow really, really fast. These are pigs. Follow the cattle. And these are pigs, in case you guys didn't realize that. See these kind of things? They got this flat, pointy nose, etc. I put rings in their noses because I don't want them to be plowing up the pasture. I want the pasture to stay intact. Pigs are very effective grazers once they learn how. It takes them about a couple of weeks to figure it out. This system right here, it used to be an alley cropping system where I was growing in the alley here. I was growing zucchini, And then after a few years, as branches started to come out into the alley, this is my oldest chestnut trees, so this is taken like 3 or 4 years ago. As the branches started to come out, I didn't want to prune them, so I planted a row of elderberry right down the middle. So I've got chestnuts over, there's red currants in the row, there's elderberry, this is a hazelnut on the other side. So it's chestnut, apples, and elderberries, and hazelnuts, currants, grapes, and mulberries all in the same system. In this area right here, we reserve exclusively for the pigs. And this is really fascinating. I just have to show this because this is part of the soil. This is what, some of these things that really what I've learned about the soil is with agroforestry systems, we have an advantage over any other systems in that we've got the full, complete soil development cycle from leaf litter to root exudates to, animals, etc. This, in case you didn't know it, is a pig turd. And notice this a bit of crumbly dirt right around here. I saw this because the turd was wiggling. And then I looked, and this little pile of dirt kept moving around and around and around, and I realized what it was is it's a burying type of dung beetle, and it was circling around underground, excavating material, and it took about 5 minutes to draw that whole poop underneath. That's where it went. So it went around and around and around. There's a whole entire pig turd down there. So I've got insects now that are burying manure, and then I guess what it does is it'll take it, it'll bring it out about 10. It'll make a little smaller piece of it, lay eggs in it, and then take it out 15 feet or so in a star pattern around where it originally dropped that turd down. So I've got these guys working for me. Chickens, oh my gosh, if you're growing hazelnuts, you got to grow chickens. You really won't have a lot of predator problems when you free range them, in part because chickens, they are naturally jungle and brushland fowl, and they hide underneath the hazelnut shrubs. And hazelnuts just love chicken poop, so the hazelnuts do better, and the chickens do better as well. Sad to report that this gal right here just died this winter. What a sweetheart she was. We affectionately called her Hen. And that's what the soil looks like, like a year later of going through, a cycle with the rolling the grains down, nice black dirt. The mixture of the clovers with the grains, multiple species of clovers, yellow clover, alsike clover, red clover, there's white clover in the whole mix. Just in the same way that we benefit from a diverse diet, so doesn't the soil life. This is the yellow sweet clover going to seed, because once you pack down the rye, the clover comes up. Then all those clovers, once they go to seed, I mash that down, and now I have clover mulch. So in the course of a season, I'll be packing down the rye first, in like around July-ish is when it happens here. And then it's usually around September-ish when I go ahead and pack down the clover. That's just me going by. You can see how I have the bucket on the front of the tractor pushing all the stuff down, holding it to the ground, just driving right over it. In the back, I've got a flail chopper. I'm not mowing it. What I'm doing is there's a roller on the back of that flail chopper that sits on the ground, and so you notice this angle, so the roller is pushing down as well. So the bucket packs it down first, and the roller helps to hold it down. And what's interesting is when I finish this job, that bucket will be half full of seed, so I got enough seed to go do it again. And that's just what it looks like when I'm packing it all down. This is a chestnut alley cropping. Notice how skinny the alleys are beginning to look. Well, the alley is no skinnier than it was way back at the beginning when you saw the yellow and the green clover and yellow sweet clover and the zucchini that was in there. The trees are bigger, and look at the yields. You can start to see all the burrs from that. That's what the clover looks like after it's packed down. And look at all the seed heads here. What do you think my biggest weed problem is in these alleys? Looks like I get a lot of clover. Look at all the clover coming up through the rye. Yay! So that, turns into that in a period of years. No trees. Looks huge. Oh, where do we go? Oh, I'm going too fast for you guys. This looks narrow. Big trees. And that's the ringer prize that I wanted to show you. I had my local NRCS guy dig the soil sample. This is out in an alley crop, a silvo arable field where we've had some sort of tillage agriculture going on there, annual crop agriculture for 15 years when this picture was taken. We've turned red clay into black topsoil. It's still, you can still see it's a sticky clay soil, but I would much rather farm in black soil than I would in red soil. And of course, black is carbon. The soil organic matter levels have gone through the roof. I can't tell you what they are right now. I have the soil tests somewhere else. And this is part of the benefit. We get to see, really wonderful yields on chestnuts, hazelnuts, etc. Now, as I'm going around through the trees, once things really close in and branches get in my way, some of the trees I'm growing, I'm also growing black walnut. I'm growing pines, the pine nut pines. And so what I do is I'll trim branches so I can get right in there with my right next to it with my tractor, and then I lay the branches across the alley, so it makes a big mess like this. And then I get some wine cap stropharia, the sawdust spawn, and just take handfuls of it and just throw it out there. And then I drive over it with the flail chopper and just chip everything up. So you can see what it looked like beforehand, and then this is one pass with the flail chopper, chipping it all up. Now what I'm not doing, I'm not growing mushrooms as my enterprise. What I am doing is I'm assisting the decomposition rate, because that's going to be releasing the nutrients, crop nutrients that the chestnuts here will need. It's converting the carbon into something that I can actually use. Now, when I get a flush of mushrooms, I'll harvest them and sell them. I'm a part of the Organic Valley Cooperative as a produce grower, and whenever I have mushrooms, they can just go right out the door. So I'll chip it all up. This is after 2 passes. There was a lot of black locust in this particular area. If you guys think black locust is a wonderful, useful tree and all that kind of stuff, I agree with you that it is. However, it's the biggest nightmare. So if you don't have black locust, don't bother planting it, because, yeah, you don't want to puncture tractor tires and stuff like that. So this is all chipped up, mostly black locust in this particular area. And you see how the sawdust comes about this big. And then that's mixed all of the stropharia spawn right in with it. And look what happens. Lo and behold, now you've got this decomposition going on. Now we're farming the decomposition cycle in addition to the growth cycle. So count the crops here. We had grains if we wanted to harvest them, which we have several times through the years. Produce in the alleys. We've got the chestnuts, we've got the hazelnuts, we've got livestock, we've got mushrooms. We're farming the entire soil building cycle. And what we're also getting is regeneration. Now, there's a big buzz these days about regenerative agriculture, and I want all of us as agroforesters to stand up for the official definition of regeneration that's been in forestry science for 400 years. The term has been used. It's the ability of a system to propagate itself, to grow, and to expand. And if your system cannot replicate itself, it is not regenerative. If you have like all these greenhouses, and it's regenerative because we increased the carbon in the soil, and a fire comes through and burns your greenhouse down, your greenhouse won't rebuild itself. That's not a regenerative system. A regenerative system has a full, complete ecology, and it will replicate itself and spread. So I get chestnut trees and hazelnut trees sprouting and expanding all across the farm. And once you have stropharia mushrooms established on your place, they naturalize quite easily, and you'll find them all over the place. They grow on a number of substrates. Leaves in the fall. If I have time and money, I'll go ahead and I'll mow the alleys in the fall, get the last dead grass and all the leaves shredded, and you'll get a good flush. I should get a flush of stropharias around May, middle of May by the time they start to come out. And that's what it looks like in the summertime. And that's been through the whole entire cycle that you've seen so far, as starting with cornfield, annual crops for cash flow, heavy cover crops with mixed grains and clovers, roll down, pack down, grazing, and then chop and drop, trimming branches, chipping it with the flail chopper, and harvesting mushrooms. Silvopasture, of course, here's some cowies out in with Walnut. This particular place has not had any machinery in that at all. It's all been managed with the animals, and that's what happens with our soil. Oh yeah, I wrote a book, Restoration Agriculture, and I chose the words on purpose, in part because as agroforesters, we have the ability to do two things at the same time. We can do ecological restoration simultaneous with agricultural production. We don't have to take land out of production and put it in CRP and set it aside in order to get nature values. We can get both out of agroforestry systems. And that is my speed presentation for the evening because I've already blown so much of your time, and I apologize for that, guys.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate all the information that you provided. I'm going to turn this over to the question and answer portion of our meeting here real quick.
Okay.
So I've turned it over to the question and answer period. Patrick's asking, when does the waste harvesting book release, or water harvesting book release?
Hey, Patrick, leave me alone, man. It was supposed to be out a long time ago. The official release date was March 1st. It's obviously not March 1st anymore, and it's obviously not released yet. I've got to like the next 2 or 3 weeks that I don't have to travel anywhere, and I'm hammering it out as best I can. I got to do my taxes and yada, yada, yada. So Patrick who? Get that guy's name. Give him a knuckle sandwich. Yeah, it's on its way, Patrick. The text is 99% done. What we're having issues with is a lot of the images. Now, if anyone is familiar with the keyline design, it's called the keyline cultivation pattern. P.A. Yeomans wrote the book Water for Every Farm. He said if you go to a key point and make a contour line, that's a horizontal line, you know, perfectly on contour, that goes from the key point both sides of the valley until the valley opens out. If you go parallel to that line and downwards in the valley with your cultivation or with mowing or whatever it is, that those lines will gradually pitch downward so the water would naturally come down the valley and then spread out to the ridge. And I would like to ask anybody out there currently who has access to, you know, online topographical maps, etc., if you can find one example of any landform in the US of A that actually follows that geometry, which, you know, all of the previous keyline writers that I've ever seen anything, they say it always works, it always works, it always works. We have spent hours and we have yet to find one where that actually works. And so all of the keyline writers also say that, you know, then adjust, ... Well, how do you adjust? That's what my water book is all about, is adjusting the keyline design system so it'll actually fit on the actual planet. So once again, get Patrick's name and number. We're going to chase him down and tie his shoes together or something.
Thanks, Patrick, for your question. I'm going to go back a little bit, and Natalie just commented that we don't think you're crazy. We know you're crazy. And then
who do you have on this webinar? Rounding people up.
So Gary has a question. He's asking, Mark, do you have any of your grass and forb strips? Wait, do you hay any of your grass and forb strips, or do you pack down all of these areas?
In three different years, I've actually harvested hay and sold hay. Why have I only done it in 3 years? Well, first of all, anybody who does hay in the humid East knows that it's a fool's game. You got like $10 zillion worth of equipment that breaks all the time, and then you go ahead and as soon as you got enough hay down, you got to bale it up. It gets rained on. So if you're depending on your own hay to feed your livestock and you get rained on, you're now feeding the crappiest hay to your animals. Your animals don't get the prime nutrition. Your whole entire system suffers. I've only harvested hay 3 times. And those were during drought years. And, you know, a lot of people would kind of like puzzle. It's like, well, drought years, if you know, nobody's got hay in drought years because it's dry as a bone. Well, I did because I've managed the water. So I've harvested the hay. Well, then if it's a drought year, you cut the hay, you drop it on the ground, and doggone it, it doesn't get rained on because it's a drought year. So then what happens to the price of hay during a drought year? The price of hay goes through the roof. So during those 3 years, I had green grass, I harvested hay, and I got paid top dollar for the finest quality hay around. So I have harvested hay. If you think again about the the whole physiology of hay, you're harvesting it when it's green, when there's the maximum amount of water-soluble nutrients, mineral nutrients up in the plant. So you harvest that, so it's maximum nutrition. Then if you haul that away, and if you're selling hay, you're just shipping your fertility off your farm. Or if you're just harvesting in the same place over time and feeding it elsewhere on the farm, you're going to end up eventually with mineral imbalances where you've been harvesting your hay. So you have to pay more attention to keeping your mineral balance online, which would include using some inputs if you need to. So with only harvesting hay 3 times in 25 years, I think that's safe to assume that I didn't lose too many nutrients by doing that.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep.
Meg asks, would you send all of us an email to let you know when your water harvesting book is ready and how we can get it?
I will. Well, it'll be available through Acres USA, and as soon as, so if you go on to Acres USA, sign up for their, they do like a weekly newsletter, and there's a pretty cool article every month, everything from, from indoor growing to chickens to cattle to, a zillion acre drylands grazing. It's all in there. So sign up through Acres USA, and when the book is finally due to be released, I will contact Savannah Institute and make sure that you guys all get notified.
Thanks, Mark. And I'll definitely follow up with everybody once it is released, and you'll get another email from us. So don't unsubscribe yet.
Gee, that's encouraging. Don't do it
no.
yet. Afterwards, then unsubscribe, right?
So Mark, it's really refreshing for me to hear you speak so much about soils and with such knowledge about soils. As a soils person myself, I have to say it's really refreshing.
Well, and one of the things about soil, this is fascinating. You research stuff over and over again. I'm looking at trees, and it's in a lot of agroforestry stuff too. Is that trees can only get about 20% of their nutritional needs from their environment directly. And of course, this is all these different researchers showing that there's something missing. How are we not able to account for what it takes to keep this tree alive? There's like 80% of the stuff is a mystery. And so reading this over and over again, that trees, only get 20% of their nutrients from naturally from the environment. So one, how do they stay alive? And two, how is it that trees can grow out of a solid rock? Most of us have seen trees growing out of the cliffs. And you tell me, who dug the $40 hole for a $10 tree? Who spent 3 years in soil preparation to make sure it was just right with cover crops and mulching and fertilizer and water? And who watered that tree religiously once a week, whether it got an inch of rain or not? The tree somehow survives on the solid rock, and there's no bloody soil, because the trees are part of what makes the soil. They're pumping those liquid sugars, that whole liquid carbon pathway, which is now lighting up the decomposition rate. All the different decomposer organisms are sucking that up. They're pooping, they're peeing, they're reproducing. The trees are sloughing roots, hard woody matter. They're dropping leaves. They're actually creating the soil. So trees run by a different set of rules. And if I can get trees to grow on the solid rock, why not plant food trees on the solid rock? And what if we add 0 inputs to that, because that cliff isn't getting any inputs? If we add 0 inputs, our costs go way down. Our yields will go down too. Because whatever yield we harvest is a positive cash flow, because we put nothing into it. So 0 is the ultimate possibility for input costs in agroforestry systems. Now, yes, you'll get higher yields. What is the marginal rate of return for anything that we do? I don't know. I'm going to err on the side of doing as little as possible, if nothing else, just to be a grand experiment, to say, wow, this is a guy here who hasn't really done anything to his system. I've got quite a messy, rough, jungly type system out there, and I don't do inputs. But what I do is I do my best to as closely imitate nature and natural processes, closely imitate the disturbance regime. Back to fire. What does fire do? It gets rid of all that brushy organic matter, so I imitate the fire. It also imitates browsing with my chainsaw and my flail chopper. And I get a yield out of it because I'm harvesting firewood, saw logs, mushroom logs, and then I chip everything up and get more mushrooms out of the chips. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
That's great. Managing the soil ecology, and I love hearing that. So we've got 2 more questions here. Tom is asking, can you please tell us about the pine nut varieties that you've planted and which are productive in Wisconsin specifically?
That's actually really great question, because I wanted to talk a lot about genetics this time. I'll talk about it on one of the future webinars that I do. Is everything that we've done at first is variety trials. So you put out a zillion different varieties of whatever it is. In the case of pine nuts, I put in single leaf pinyon, double leaf pinyon, Siberian pine, Italian pine, Himalayan pine, Korean pine, and put them out in a particular area, and then I treated them with my now trademarked registered management technique called STUN, which is sheer total utter neglect. And of all of those, I've got a couple of Siberian pines still alive, and they're not happy. And Korean pine survived and thrived. Well, then once I've got that right there, tells me what varieties work well on my place. Then within the survivors, I started to go for the ones that had cones the first, and then I start replanting those seeds. So the first Korean pine took about 8 years before I got my first cones. That second batch, I started selecting seed from trees that had cones by year 4. So all of the seed that I use now to generate new little Korean pines came from parents that produced cones by year 4. Now, does that mean that their children will produce cones by year 4? Not necessarily, but there's a higher percentage of them that will. And so then what's also interesting is the trees that have more cones, they have more seeds that get represented in the gene pool. So we've got trees that survive with no inputs, that produce at a young age, and then the one that produces the most gets the most baby trees produced from it. So we're naturally concentrating by our management, we're concentrating fast reproduction and heavy yields with no inputs. Pest and disease free, of course, because if you get a pest or disease at my place, you die. Pretty easy.
Great, thank you. Tammy asks, what is the most effective way to keep the spray from drifting from neighbors' farm fields?
That was one of the first things that we did is to plant a perimeter. I did a single row of hybrid poplar and then a double row of white spruce because they were cheap. I could get them at the the DNR for like $150 for 1,000 of them. And so the hybrid poplars were the really quick, fast up out of the ground. They're inexpensive. You get unrooted cuttings for sometimes as little as $1. And so I had a barrier of hybrid poplar and then white spruce, and it was 10 years in that I harvested the hybrid poplar, milled it up into boards, and built the cider mill building that you saw back in the pictures there, and then inoculated a whole bunch with oyster mushroom. Well, they of course sprout back from the roots, but they're always behind the spruce trees by now. In its time, I'm starting to cut them again. I'm going through the second time. It's only 8 years this time out, and so I'm cutting more, and I don't really have any need for lumber right now. So as of right now, I'm just kind of cutting it up and using it for firewood. It's super fast. It's like the April morning wood. Takes the chill off, burns real quick, and then lots of oyster mushrooms. So also hybrid willow works pretty good. It's also fast and inexpensive to do. I've got a lot of that going on as a barrier. But if we live in agriculture country, we just got to get used to the fact that every once in a while, I see the spray rigs going by. It's time to go to town and have Chinese food or something.
Thanks. And Natalie commented, I heard from a friend that tree seeds, poops from birds, have a 95% germination rate. Perhaps we should make tree seed bird food blocks so that birds can do the planting for us. Or maybe feed them to the chickens.
Yeah, well, I've fed mulberries to chickens. One of the things that is a problem with that is the fact that chickens do have rocks in their gizzard, and they grind up a lot of those seeds. So not many seeds make it through the birds. But if you've got something like mulberry where there's like a zillion little seeds in it, they're very happy to go through birds. And one of the things is that some of the species around, like Kentucky coffee tree and honey locust, for example, used to be eaten by giraffes, and then many of the seeds would pass right through, and also eaten by mastodons and that sort. So what I did when I first got to the farm here is every morning I'd take a handful of honey locust seeds and swallow them like vitamins because they go down really easy. And then when I was out on the farm planting trees, if I had to take care of business, I just dig a hole and take care of business. And there are at least 6 honey locust trees that are growing on my farm that I know exactly where they came from. So, yeah. Here's actually one of the most significant things with seed. A lot of people have questions about like the stratification process. It's got to do this and that and freeze it and put it in sand and blah blah blah. It's like, wait a minute. When the fruit is ripe on the tree, let's take cherries for example. In Wisconsin in July, they're ripe. That's the time that the seed goes in the ground. Bang, put it in the ground. And what happens to it between then and next spring is exactly what it needs. Because you think, why on earth would fruit ripen at the time that it does? Because it's perfect time to put that seed in the ground. So, acorns, get them in the fall, put them right in the ground. Chestnut, put them right in the ground. Whatever it is, when that seed is ready, plant it. And it'll stratify naturally, normally, really easily. Of course, you got to protect from rodents and all that kind of stuff so they don't dig it up.
Thanks. Patrick asks, can you recommend any resources for finding native pre-European settlement plant lists for individual biomes?
Aside from searching it, there's what the heck is the name of the book? Oh, there's a book on, and the title escapes me right now. It's about the plant species that were critically dependent on the megafauna, such as the Kentucky coffee tree and the honey locust and stuff like that. And that had a lot of different plants that required that, and so you'd get a lot of that from there. I just look it up on the internet. Favorite search engine.
And then he also asks, what's your opinion concerning evergreen windbreaks versus deciduous?
Well, one doesn't have to have an opinion. One just can observe, and different types of windbreaks have different effects. And it's, I think it's Richard Kallenbach from University of Missouri Columbia has done extensive research on windbreak species, configuration, densities, etc. And the density of the windbreak determines how much wind actually comes through it, and so the density and the height has an effect on the wind shadow, downwind from it. So different densities and the different heights affect that. The evergreens, if you're going to be in an area where there is actually winter, if you have a evergreen windbreak to the south of any kind of vehicle ways, you're going to have ice and snow that remains a lot longer on the north side just because it's shaded so much. I've got all these little glaciers on the north sides of it. I got a windbreak, big curved windbreak around the house, and it's got this huge glacier, probably 6 or 8 inches thick. All the snow's melted by now, but I still have these glaciers in the shade. So you just do some of the research on that. Evergreen windbreaks are different than deciduous windbreaks. They have different effects. You choose which one works for you.
Okay. Mark is asking, could you tell us a few things that you would have done, or could you tell us a few things that you've done that didn't work out or that you wouldn't recommend doing?
So who asked that?
Mark Amante.
Oh, I was going to say, well, now I am crazy because I'm asking myself my own questions. Now right, crazy. So, probably the biggest one, there's a lot of things that I did and things failed to thrive. I didn't take that as a failure. That's positive feedback. I'm just not going to put any effort into that at all. I go with what's working. And so to me, something like that isn't necessarily a failure. It's success, because I want to know quick what's not going to work, and I'm just done with that. I'm not going to waste my time trying to do all these different things. I don't care if you do this and do that, to make it work. Screw it. I'm not going to waste that time. So I don't really see things that way, like what didn't work, it doesn't work. But one of the things that I definitely have learned that kind of bit me in the butt, still is actually, I was originally inspired by Tree Crops, J. Russell Smith. Well, then I discovered Permaculture Designer's Manual, Bill Mollison. And in Permaculture 1, I think it is, and then in the Designer's Manual, he talks about what he calls rolling permaculture. You set up a little bit here, and once it's established, then you go set up a little bit next to it, and a little bit next to it, and a little bit next to it, and eventually you've got the whole 1,000 acres covered with permaculture. Well, that is probably the most foolish advice that you could possibly follow. You can think about this. If you plant, like, I'm going to plant 100 hazelnut bushes. Well, then next year I'll plant another 100 hazelnut bushes, and then another 100 hazelnut every single year. Well, the first year you've got planting and then maintenance. Well, then the second year you went and you planted again on the second planting, and you got to maintain that. Well, then you got to go back and maintain the first. Well, then you go year 3, you're planting again, and then you're maintaining year 2, and you're maintaining year 1. Well, then year 4 and year 5, by the time you hit year 5, now you got some decent yields off your first hazelnuts, and you only got 100 freaking bushes. And that's not enough to be economically worth the effort to go harvest it. And so when doing this all over again, and with working with other clients, as much as you can afford to put in the ground right here, right now, do it all at once. Get the planting over with. Now you've got maintenance for the next 3 years is going to be the nightmare of maintenance, and you may have to have irrigation, if you go in a drought cycle, etc. So you're geared up and you're ready for this 3-year high-intensity, challenge of getting everything to stay alive, and then you're done. And now, once you start to get yields, you've got enough to make it economically worthwhile to go ahead and do. And so if that was one thing that I could recommend, is I encourage you to plant as much of whatever your key species are. Get as many of them in the ground as soon as possible.
Great. And is there one thing that you wish you would have known starting out? Kind of following up on Mark's question here, is there just one thing that, thinking back 23 years ago when you're just getting started, like, is there one thing you wish you would have known starting out?
Wow, that's a cool question. Well, and think about when I did start, that many years ago, there were no hazelnuts commercially grown in Wisconsin. There were no chestnut varieties that actually survive in Wisconsin. I actually had a conversation that many years ago with Dr. Dennis Fulbright from Michigan State University. I said, well, I want to grow chestnuts in Wisconsin. He says, well, you can't. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, they won't grow there. It's too cold. And I said, well, if I were to grow chestnuts in Wisconsin, what should I do? What should I choose? He says, well, what you do is you pick the species that have a 20-year track record of high production, blah, 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 blah. And so the university information was absolutely useless. So I had to learn everything on the fly. And so think about how crazy that guy was 23 years ago. He says, I'm gonna not just start my farm, I'm gonna help to launch industries with crops that don't even grow here commercially. That guy was, man, what was he on? And so I guess the one thing that I would have wanted to know, I really like that question. Ask it again how he phrased it.
So what's the number one thing you wish you would have known when you were just starting out?
Oh, cool. I'd like to if he's back on the next time I do a webinar, ask that question again. I'll give it a little thought. That's a really cool question.
Okay. All right. We'll put that on the table for next time then. Let's see here. Ethan asks, do you know of any good resources offhand to study biomes?
Almost every state has like a book on natural plant communities, and that would be the key phrase. The key phrases are habitat types. That's what foresters use, is habitat types, and natural plant communities are more what the ecologists use as the language. And so you just do a search on that. You know, whether you're looking for textbooks, there's oodles of them. Oodles of them out there. A lot of material on that.
Great, thanks. That's really great advice. I think Gary's asking. Oh wait, he provided a link here. So Gary, if you're on the chat or if you're on computer, you can see the chat. Gary has a link here for the USDA National Agroforestry Center. They have lots of great resources for windbreaks and other agroforestry practices.
They really do. And the nature, is this the same Gary that asked a question earlier?
I think so, Gary Wyatt.
Oh, I was going to say, I bet you it's Gary Wyatt.
Yep,
Hi, Gary.
Yep, it is.
Hi, Gary. Yeah, you always, Gary's kind of quiet.
Gary says hi.
Hi, Gary. He's a quiet guy, but, he's thinking a mile a minute, and when he says something or asks something, it's like totally right on point. So, and he's been a stalwart in the whole agroforestry thing for a long time. A lot of patience. So, thanks for doing what you've done through the years, Gary.
Well, he says thanks, Mark.
Yay. Agroforesters, we got to stick together and encourage one another because, really, quite frankly, we are a drop in the bucket agriculturally nationwide. What we do is barely understood by most people, and we need to encourage each other as best we can and support one another in our work. So all of you guys who are on this webinar and practicing agroforestry in whatever capacity, keep up the good work. Because our work will outlive us, and that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. I like thinking about it that way.
And actually, there's and I was just going to look, see if I can find it. And I really have to go to the bathroom pretty seriously. But what I want to do is some of my biggest paychecks, my most significant paychecks, come in the form of these beautiful moments that happen. Now, you saw the cornfield turned into this rich, lush system, etc. Well, coming up, not too far from now in Wisconsin, some of my favorite encouragement or whatever, will be happening. And let's see if that works. Come on, do it for me. See if you can hear that. Can you hear that?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Sounds like a symphony.
And that's in a sterile, dead, once upon a herbicide corn stubble field after 20 years of agroforestry. We're doing good work.
Yeah,
and with
that's
that,
great.
I'm going to call it a night.
Okay. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. And
all right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And thank you, everybody, else for joining, waiting for the presentation to begin. And I hope you all have a really great night.